Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones to honor the people we've lost. For 39-year-old Nora Whitfield, every sunrise on her father's Colorado ranch was both a blessing and a burden she carried alone. She'd been fighting droughts, debts, and neighbors who thought she should give up. Then one evening, while fixing fences, she found something strange hidden under a fallen log. A nest of eggs that didn't belong to any animal she knew. When they hatched, the creatures inside were worth more than her entire ranch. But others wanted them too, and soon dangerous people started coming around. Nora had to choose between saving her family's land or protecting these rare creatures. What would you do if saving a miracle meant sacrificing everything your family built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air held that particular bite that came with October mornings in Colorado, sharp enough to remind you winter was settling in for a long stay. Nora Whitfield pulled her father's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the wraparound porch of the ranch house. Steam rising from her coffee mug like morning prayers, ascending to a sky painted in shades of pearl and gold. 5 years had passed since Samuel Whitfield's heart gave out during a particularly brutal calving season, and Nora still found herself listening for the sound of his boots on these same wooden planks, the gentle clearing of his throat that always preceded his morning weather predictions, the silence where his presence should have been felt. Heavier than the mortgage payments that arrived with clockwork precision every month, she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the leather journal he'd carried for 30 years, its cover worn smooth by countless hands and weather. Every page contained his careful handwriting, notes about cattle prices, weather patterns, fence repairs needed, and scattered among the practical observations. Moments of poetry that revealed the gentle soul beneath the weathered rancher exterior. "The land doesn't belong to us," he'd written on a page she'd memorized. "We belong to it. Our job is to listen to what it needs and be worthy of the trust." The Whitfield Ranch sprawled across 800 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving terrain in Routt County. Rolling pastures gave way to dense pine forests that climbed toward the Continental Divide, where snow-capped peaks stood like ancient sentinels watching over the valley below. The property had been in their family for 4 generations, each one adding their own mark to the legacy. The original homestead cabin that now served as a guest house. The sturdy barn her grandfather had built with his own hands. The intricate network of irrigation channels that turned high desert into viable grazing land. But beauty didn't pay the bills, and legacy didn't impress the loan officers at First National Bank of Steamboat Springs. Nora had learned that lesson the hard way over the past 5 years. Every conversation with Harold Morrison, the bank's agricultural loan specialist, followed the same depressing script. Numbers that didn't add up, market conditions that continued to deteriorate. The suggestion, delivered with practiced sympathy, that perhaps it was time to consider her options. "I'm not saying you should sell," Harold had told her just last week, his manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany desk in his climate-controlled office. "But you have to be realistic, Nora. Cattle prices are down 18% from last year. The drought has been particularly hard on smaller operations. There are developers who would pay well above market value for a property like yours." She'd wanted to tell him about the way morning light caught the aspen trees in autumn, turning them into torches of gold and amber that took your breath away. She'd wanted to explain about the family of elk that bedded down near the north pasture every winter, or the clarity of the creek water that ran through the property, so pure you could drink from it without a second thought. Instead, she'd nodded politely and promised to think about it. The truth was, thinking was about all she could afford to do these days. The ranch employed 2 full-time hands, Tom Martinez, who'd worked for her father for 15 years, and his nephew Eddie, a kid barely out of high school who worked twice as hard as men with twice his experience. Both men treated her with the kind of respectful deference they'd shown her father, never once suggesting she didn't know what she was doing. even when it was obvious she was learning on the job. "Miss Nora," Tom had said yesterday, while they were checking the south fence line. "You know we're behind you whatever you decide. This place, it's got good bones. Your daddy built something solid here." The neighbors were less diplomatic in their assessments. Ruth Patterson, whose own ranch bordered the Whitfield property to the east, had made her opinions clear at the monthly Grange meeting. "It's nothing personal against the girl," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone older women used when they wanted to sound reasonable while delivering criticism. "But running a ranch isn't a hobby. It takes a certain kind of strength, and frankly, I'm not sure she has it in her." Others nodded in agreement. Ed Hutchins mentioned the fence repairs he'd noticed weren't getting done. Mary Lou Thompson brought up the cattle that had gotten loose last month and wandered onto the highway. Small infractions that taken individually might be forgiven. Collectively, they painted a picture of a woman who was in over her head. They weren't entirely wrong. Nora reflected as she walked toward the barn, where Tom was already preparing feed for the morning routine. She'd grown up on this ranch, spent summers working alongside her father, learned to ride before she could properly walk. But there was a difference between helping with ranch work and being responsible for every decision that determined whether the operation succeeded or failed. Her father had tried to prepare her, especially in those final months when his heart condition made it clear his time was limited. Long evenings spent going over the books, explaining the relationships with suppliers and buyers, sharing the accumulated wisdom of decades spent working the land. But book learning was different from the kind of knowledge that came from living through multiple drought cycles, navigating the complexities of cattle markets, making the 100 small decisions every day that kept a ranch profitable. "Morning, Miss Nora," Tom called out as she approached. At 52, he was built like a man who'd spent his life doing physical work. Broad shoulders, weathered hands, the kind of steady competence that came from years of experience. "Check the weather forecast. We might get some snow by the weekend. How are the cattle looking?" "Good overall. Had to move the herd from the north pasture yesterday. Grass is getting pretty thin up there. But they're in good shape heading into winter." They worked together in comfortable silence, filling feed troughs and checking water systems. This was the part of ranch life Nora genuinely loved, the physical work, the direct connection to the animals and the land. It was the business side that kept her awake at night, staring at spreadsheets that never seemed to balance. No matter how many times she ran the numbers, the afternoon brought Eddie Martinez back from town with supplies and an expression that suggested he had news to share. At 19, Eddie possessed that combination of enthusiasm and inexperience that made him both invaluable and occasionally frustrating. He worked harder than anyone had a right to expect, but he also had a tendency to get excited about things that didn't necessarily warrant excitement. "Miss Nora," he called out as he climbed down from the supply truck, "you'll never guess what I heard in town. Try me. There's some kind of wildlife expert asking questions about unusual animals in the area. Some city fellow with a fancy car talking to folks at Miller's Feed about rare birds and such." Nora felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of questions?" "Just general stuff, I guess. Whether anyone had seen anything unusual. Big birds, maybe. Different from the usual hawks and eagles." Eddie shrugged. "Probably some university researcher or something. But I thought it was interesting." "Did he leave a name?" "Not with me, but Betty Miller might know." "Want me to call over there?" "No, that's fine." Probably nothing important. But as she helped Eddie unload supplies, Nora found herself thinking about the stranger's questions. The mountains were full of wildlife: deer, elk, black bears, mountain lions, and dozens of species of birds. But unusual birds, rare enough to warrant special interest from an expert. That was something different. That evening, after Tom and Eddie had headed home to their families, Nora walked her usual route along the fence lines that bordered the property. It was a habit inherited from her father, who'd insisted that checking fences was the most important job on any ranch. "Good fences make good neighbors," he used to say, "but more than that, they keep your cattle where they belong and other folks' problems where they belong." The work was meditative in its repetition, walking the perimeter, checking for broken posts or sagging wire, looking for signs of wear that might lead to bigger problems down the road. It gave her time to think, to process the day's challenges, and plan for tomorrow's work. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold when she reached the section of fence that ran along the old oak grove. This was her favorite part of the property, where mature trees provided shade in summer and shelter in winter for the cattle. Her great-grandfather had left this section untouched when he'd cleared other areas for pasture, recognizing that sometimes the best thing you could do for land was leave it alone. It was here, near a fallen log that had probably been down for decades, that Nora's life was about to change forever. At first, she thought she was looking at a rock formation, or perhaps some debris that had washed down from higher elevations during the last heavy rain. But as she moved closer, her trained eye began to pick out details that didn't fit with either explanation. The objects were arranged too precisely to be natural, nestled together in a shallow depression beneath the shelter of the fallen oak. And they were too uniform in size and shape to be random debris. As the last light of day slanted through the trees, Nora realized she was looking at eggs. But these weren't like any eggs she'd ever seen on the ranch. 5 eggs nestled together in what appeared to be a carefully constructed nest, each one roughly the size of Nora's closed fist. Their shells caught the dying light with an almost iridescent quality, displaying subtle patterns of speckled brown and cream that seemed to shift and change as she moved around them. They were beautiful in a way that made her breath catch, but also profoundly unsettling in their strangeness. In 39 years of life on this ranch, Nora had seen the eggs of virtually every bird species native to the Colorado mountains. She'd helped her father track nesting patterns of hawks and eagles, had watched osprey raise their young near the creek, had even discovered the occasional owl nest in the barn loft. These eggs belonged to none of those familiar species. They were too large to be from any of the common songbirds, too distinctively marked to belong to waterfowl, and shaped differently from the raptor eggs she knew well. More concerning, they were arranged with a precision that suggested intelligence, as if whatever had created this nest had carefully considered the placement of each egg for maximum protection and warmth. Nora knelt beside the fallen log, close enough to see the fine details of the shells without disturbing the nest. The eggs appeared to be healthy. No cracks or discoloration, no signs of abandonment. In fact, she could swear she detected the faintest movement, the subtle shifting that indicated life developing within. Her practical rancher's instincts warred with a curiosity that had been awakened by Eddie's news about the wildlife expert in town. The smart thing would be to leave the nest undisturbed and report it to the Department of Wildlife. Wild animals were protected by law, and interfering with their nesting sites could result in serious penalties. But something about the discovery felt significant beyond the normal rhythms of ranch life. The timing felt important, finding these eggs just hours after hearing about a researcher asking questions about unusual birds in the area. The location was significant too, hidden in a part of the property where she rarely had reason to venture, protected by the natural shelter of the oak grove. As darkness settled over the mountains, Nora made a decision that would have long-term consequences she couldn't imagine. She would keep the discovery secret, at least temporarily, and monitor the nest herself. The walk back to the ranch house felt different than usual, charged with the weight of hidden knowledge. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. The hooting of a great horned owl from the direction of the creek made her pause and listen more carefully than she ever had before. Inside the house, she went straight to her father's office, a small room lined with agricultural journals, veterinary manuals, and reference books about the local ecosystem. If these eggs belonged to a species she should recognize, the information would be here. For 2 hours, she pored over field guides and identification charts, comparing measurements and descriptions with her memory of what she'd seen. Nothing matched exactly, The closest approximations were some of the larger raptor species, but even those fell short of explaining the distinctive characteristics she'd observed. Finally, she turned to the internet, though the ranch's satellite connection was frustratingly slow. She searched for information about rare birds in Colorado, unusual nesting behaviors, and recent wildlife sightings in the area. Most of what she found was routine: citizen science reports of common species, birdwatching groups documenting their observations, academic papers that were too technical to be immediately useful. But one article caught her attention, a piece from the Denver Post about the reintroduction of California condors in Utah, and speculation about whether similar programs might be attempted in other western states. The accompanying photos showed eggs that were similar in size to what she'd found, though the markings were different. Condors. The possibility sent a chill down her spine. If the eggs belonged to condors or some related species, their value would be immense, not just financially, but scientifically and environmentally. Condors had been nearly extinct, their recovery one of the most expensive and complex conservation efforts in American history. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every time Nora closed her eyes, she saw those speckled shells catching the light, imagined the life developing within. She found herself listening to sounds from outside with new attention, wondering if she might hear the calls of adult birds returning to their nest. At first light, she was dressed and walking back toward the oak grove, carrying a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars. The nest looked exactly as she'd left it, the eggs undisturbed, the surrounding area showing no signs of additional activity. She settled herself behind a cluster of aspens about 50 feet away, far enough to avoid disturbing whatever might be nesting, but close enough to observe any activity. For an hour she watched and waited, occasionally scanning the sky for signs of adult birds that might be associated with the nest. Nothing happened. As the sun climbed higher and the demands of ranch work called, Nora reluctantly made her way back to the house. Tom and Eddie would arrive soon, and she needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy while she figured out what to do about her discovery. "Morning, Miss Nora," Tom called out as she approached the barn. "You're out early today." "Couldn't sleep," she said, which was true enough. "Thought I'd check that section of fence by the oak grove. Find anything that needs fixing?" The question felt loaded with significance, though she knew Tom was simply making conversation. "Nothing urgent," she replied, "but I'll keep an eye on it." Throughout the morning routine of feeding and checking cattle, Nora found herself distracted, her thoughts returning repeatedly to the hidden nest. She made mistakes she normally wouldn't make, forgetting to latch a gate, miscounting the cattle in the south pasture, losing track of conversations midway through. "You feeling all right?" Eddie asked during their lunch break. "You seem kind of far away today." "Just tired," she said. "Didn't get much sleep last night." But the truth was more complicated. The discovery of the eggs had awakened something in her that had been dormant since her father's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply maintaining what he'd built. For the first time in years, she felt like she was on the verge of something important, something that might justify all the struggles to keep the ranch operational. After Tom and Eddie left for the day, Nora returned to the oak grove. The eggs remained undisturbed, but something had changed in the surrounding area. Fresh scratches in the soil suggested that some large animal had been investigating the site. The marks were too big to belong to any of the common forest creatures, squirrels or chipmunks, or even raccoons. She knelt to examine the scratches more closely, trying to interpret what they might tell her. The marks seemed deliberate, as if made by something with significant size and strength. Claws, certainly, but larger than she would expect from local wildlife. As she studied the ground, a sound from above made her look up toward the canopy of the oak tree. For just a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow that was too large and moved too deliberately to be explained by wind or falling leaves. But when she focused her attention on the spot, there was nothing there. The walk back to the house felt different again, charged with a new kind of awareness. She found herself scanning the sky more carefully, listening to sounds with heightened attention. Twice she stopped and turned around, convinced she was being watched, but seeing nothing unusual in the landscape behind her. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing the day's work and planning tomorrow's tasks, Nora made a decision that would set everything in motion. She would contact Dr. Sarah Martinez, the wildlife veterinarian who occasionally consulted for ranchers in the area. Sarah had worked with her father on several occasions, dealing with wildlife issues that intersected with ranch operations. If anyone could help her identify the species and determine the appropriate course of action, it would be Sarah. But even as she reached for the phone, Nora hesitated. When she involved someone else, the secret would no longer be entirely hers. The discovery would become official, subject to regulations and procedures that might take the decision-making power out of her hands. On the other hand, if the eggs belonged to a protected species, especially a rare or endangered one, attempting to handle the situation alone could have serious legal consequences. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah's voicemail picked up. "You've reached Dr. Sarah Martinez. I'm either with a patient or in the field, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." "Sarah, this is Nora Whitfield out at the old Whitfield Ranch. I found something on the property that I'd like you to take a look at when you have a chance. It's probably nothing, but I'd appreciate your professional opinion. Give me a call when you get this message." After hanging up, Nora sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or the smartest decision of her life. Outside, the mountain night was settling in with its familiar sounds. Wind through the pines, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But tonight, those familiar sounds seemed different somehow. Tonight, they seemed like the soundtrack to a world that was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah Martinez returned Nora's call early the next morning, her voice carrying the professional warmth that had made her a trusted resource for ranchers throughout the region. "Nora, good to hear from you. How are things at the ranch?" "Getting by," Nora replied, which had become her standard response to that question. "Sarah, I found something yesterday that I'd like you to look at. Some eggs that don't match anything I can identify." "What kind of eggs?" "Where did you find them?" "That's the thing. I'm not sure what kind they are. They're in a nest on the property, tucked away in the oak grove near the back fence line. They're large, maybe 4 inches long, with unusual markings. I've gone through all of Dad's field guides, and nothing matches." There was a pause on the line, the kind that suggested Sarah was thinking through possibilities. "Could they belong to one of the larger raptors? Golden eagles, maybe?" "I don't think so. The shape is wrong, and the markings are different from any raptor eggs I've seen. Plus, the nest construction seems more sophisticated than what you'd expect from local species." "Interesting. I can come out this afternoon if you'd like. I'm finishing up with a call near Hayden, so I could swing by around 3 o'clock. After hanging up, Nora felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Having Sarah examine the eggs would provide professional insight, but it would also make the discovery official in a way that couldn't be undone. She spent the morning trying to focus on regular ranch duties, but found herself repeatedly drawn back to the oak grove. Each visit revealed the eggs unchanged, but the surrounding area showed increasing signs of activity. More scratches in the soil, disturbed vegetation, and what looked like large feathers caught on nearby branches. The feathers were unlike anything she'd seen before, glossy black with an almost metallic sheen, longer and broader than the feathers of local birds. She carefully collected several samples, storing them in a manila envelope to show Sarah. At noon, while she was checking water troughs in the north pasture, Tom approached with a concerned expression. "Miss Nora, we might have a problem. Found some fresh tire tracks this morning along the access road that runs behind the property. Looks like someone was out there during the night. Could have been hunters," she suggested. "Though hunting season was still weeks away, maybe, but the tracks suggest they stopped and got out of the vehicle. Spent some time walking around. And hunters don't usually scout in the dark. The news added a new layer of worry to Nora's already complicated situation. If someone else knew about the eggs, or was at least investigating unusual activity on the property, her window for making informed decisions might be closing rapidly. She walked the access road with Tom, examining the tire tracks and footprints he'd discovered. The tread pattern suggested a large vehicle, possibly an SUV or truck. The footprints were from heavy boots, size 10 or 11, and showed the deliberate pattern of someone conducting a methodical search. "You want me to call the sheriff?" Tom asked. "Could be we've got poachers checking out the property. Let me think about it," Nora replied. Involving law enforcement would bring exactly the kind of official attention she was hoping to avoid, at least until she better understood what she was dealing with. Sarah arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, driving the modified pickup truck that served as her mobile veterinary clinic. At 35, she had the kind of practical competence that came from years of working with both domestic and wild animals in challenging conditions. Her dark hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail, and she wore the sturdy clothing of someone who spent more time outdoors than in an office. "So," she said, as they walked toward the oak grove, "tell me more about these mysterious eggs." Nora explained the circumstances of her discovery, carefully omitting any mention of the tire tracks or her growing suspicion that others might be aware of the situation. She led Sarah to the viewing position she'd established behind the aspen cluster and handed her the binoculars. For several minutes, Sarah studied the nest in silence, occasionally adjusting the focus or shifting her position slightly. When she finally lowered the binoculars, her expression was troubled. "Nora, these aren't from any species I immediately recognize. The size and markings suggest something significant. Have you seen any adult birds in the area?" "Not directly. But I found these." Nora handed over the envelope containing the black feathers. Sarah examined them carefully, holding them up to catch the afternoon light. The metallic sheen was even more pronounced in direct sunlight, creating an almost prismatic effect that was beautiful and unsettling. "These are definitely not from local species," Sarah said quietly. "The size, the coloring, the structure, they're consistent with some of the larger scavenging birds. Possibly condors or a related species." "Condors? In Colorado? It shouldn't be possible. The last native condors in this region were gone by the 1920s, but these physical characteristics are consistent with that family of birds." They spent another hour observing the nest and examining the surrounding area. Sarah was particularly interested in the scratch marks Nora had discovered, taking photographs and measurements with the systematic approach of someone trained in scientific documentation. "I need to do some research," Sarah said as they walked back toward her truck. "But Nora, if these eggs belong to a rare or endangered species, we're looking at a situation that could have significant implications. Legal, environmental, and potentially financial." "What do you mean, financial?" "Rare bird eggs can be incredibly valuable to collectors, researchers, or certain types of organizations. We're talking about potential values in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the species." The number hit Nora like a physical blow. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. More than enough to save the ranch, pay off the mortgage, and secure her future on the land her family had worked for generations. But Sarah's next words tempered any excitement she might have felt. "Of course, selling or disturbing protected species eggs is a federal crime with severe penalties. If these belong to an endangered species, the only legal course of action would be to report them to Fish and Wildlife Services." After Sarah left, promising to research the possibilities and return with more information within a few days, Nora found herself alone with knowledge that felt increasingly dangerous. The eggs represented either salvation or catastrophe, depending on how she chose to handle the situation. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun set behind the western peaks, Nora noticed a vehicle parked on the ridge road that overlooked her property. It was too far away to make out details, but it appeared to be a dark-colored SUV, positioned to provide a clear view of the ranch buildings and surrounding area. She retrieved her father's old Winchester from above the mantel, checking to make sure it was loaded. Samuel Whitfield had been a peaceful man, but he'd also been practical about the realities of living in remote country where help might be hours away. The vehicle remained in position until full darkness fell, then disappeared without ever approaching the property directly. As Nora locked the doors and checked the windows before heading to bed, she realized that whatever was developing around the mysterious eggs was becoming larger and more complex than anything she'd imagined. The secret she'd hoped to keep for a few more days was already attracting attention from multiple directions, and she still had no idea what was going to hatch from those 5 speckled shells hidden in the oak grove. The brass compass had belonged to Nora's mother, Elena, who'd carried it during her years as a wilderness guide before marrying Samuel Whitfield and settling into ranch life. Now, as Nora held the familiar weight in her palm, she found herself wishing for the kind of clear direction it had once provided to travelers lost in the mountains. 3 days had passed since Sarah's visit, and the eggs were showing unmistakable signs of imminent hatching. Subtle movements were visible through the shells, and occasionally Nora could hear faint tapping sounds from within. Whatever was developing inside those speckled shells was ready to enter the world, and she still had no clear plan for what would happen. Sarah had called that morning with preliminary research results that only deepened the mystery. I've consulted with colleagues at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and sent photos of the feathers to a specialist at the Smithsonian, she'd reported. Everyone agrees the physical characteristics are consistent with California condors, but that raises more questions than it answers. What kind of questions? Well, condors haven't nested in Colorado for over a century. The reintroduction programs have been focused on California and Utah, with strict monitoring of every individual bird. If these eggs belong to condors, they represent either an unknown breeding population or something even more unusual. That afternoon, Nora's contemplation of the situation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A sleek black sedan pulled into her driveway, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of rural ranch country. He was perhaps 45 years old, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested city life and corporate success. His shoes were leather and looked like they cost more than most people spent on a month's groceries. Everything about him screamed outsider, but he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Whitfield?" he called out as he approached the porch where Nora was sorting through feed invoices. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm a wildlife consultant, and I believe you may have something on your property that could be of mutual interest." The directness of his approach caught her off guard. "I'm sorry, what kind of mutual interest?" "I represent certain parties who are very interested in rare wildlife sightings, particularly large birds that might be nesting in this region. I understand you may have made a discovery that fits that description." Nora's blood ran cold. How could this stranger know about the eggs? She told only Sarah, and she trusted the veterinarian completely. "I think you may have the wrong ranch, Mr. Chen. I haven't reported any unusual wildlife sightings." His smile was polite but predatory. "Of course, discretion is admirable. But, Miss Whitfield, if you have indeed discovered what I think you have, the financial implications could be quite significant. The parties I represent are prepared to make very generous offers for access to certain types of specimens. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Chen reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, setting it on the porch railing between them. "My contact information. When you're ready to discuss this situation more openly, I hope you'll call. Time can be a factor in these matters, so I'd encourage you not to delay too long." After he left, Nora examined the business card with growing unease. It identified Chen as a senior consultant with something called bioacquisition services, but provided no additional information about the nature of his business or the identity of his clients. A quick internet search revealed even less. Bioacquisition services had a minimal web presence, just a basic contact page with an address in Denver and a vague description of services related to rare biological specimens and conservation consulting. The phrase rare biological specimens sent chills down Nora's spine. It suggested the kind of operation that might be more interested in profit than conservation. The type of organization that trafficked in rare animals for private collectors or research facilities that operated outside normal ethical boundaries. That evening, she called Sarah to report Chen's visit and share the business card information. "I don't like this," Sarah said immediately. "Bioacquisition services. I've never heard of them. But the name suggests exactly the kind of outfit that gives legitimate wildlife work a bad reputation. If they're sniffing around your property, it means word is getting out about your discovery. But how? The only people who know are you and me. Sometimes information leaks in ways we don't expect. Maybe someone saw me visiting the property and drew conclusions. Maybe Chen's organization has contacts within the wildlife services community. Or maybe they're monitoring communications somehow. The possibility that her phone calls might be monitored added a new layer of paranoia to an already stressful situation. What should I do? First, don't have any more contact with Chen or his organization. If they're what I suspect they are, any engagement will be seen as encouragement. Second, we need to make a decision about reporting this to Fish and Wildlife Services. If these eggs belong to a protected species, the longer we wait, the more complicated this becomes. But that decision was taken out of their hands the following morning, when Nora arrived at the oak grove to discover that the eggs had begun to hatch. The first crack appeared in the largest egg just as the morning sun filtered through the canopy above. It started as a tiny fissure, no bigger than a hairline fracture, but within minutes it had expanded into a network of breaks that revealed glimpses of movement within. Nora positioned herself in her usual observation spot and settled in to witness what promised to be either a miracle or a disaster, depending on what emerged from those shells. The hatching process was slower and more laborious than she'd expected. For nearly 2 hours, she watched as the first chick worked to break free from its shell, occasionally hearing faint peeping sounds that were unlike any bird calls she'd encountered before. The sound was deeper, more resonant than typical chick vocalizations, suggesting something significantly larger than common songbirds. When the first chick finally emerged, Nora's breath caught in her throat. The creature was magnificent and alien at the same time. About the size of a small chicken, but with proportions that were entirely different. It had glossy black down covering most of its body, and a distinctive ruff of feathers around its neck. The head was oversized relative to the body, with intelligent dark eyes and a beak that was clearly designed for a scavenging lifestyle. But it was the wings that confirmed her worst fears and greatest hopes. Even in their undeveloped state, they were enormous relative to the chick's body size, suggesting an adult wingspan that could reach 8 or 9 feet. She was looking at a baby California condor. As if summoned by some primal instinct, the other eggs began showing signs of hatching activity. By noon, 3 chicks had fully emerged, and the remaining 2 were working their way toward freedom. Nora found herself caught between wonder and terror. The chicks were beautiful, displaying behaviors and physical characteristics that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. But they also represented a complexity that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to control. California condors were among the most endangered birds in the world. Every individual was precious to conservation efforts, but they were also protected by layers of federal regulation that carried severe criminal penalties for unauthorized possession or interference. As she watched the newly hatched chicks exploring their nest with unsteady movements, Nora realized that her decision-making window had essentially closed. These were no longer potential discoveries that she could choose to report or keep secret. They were living creatures that required specialized care and legal protection. But even as she accepted the inevitability of involving federal authorities, She couldn't shake the memory of Marcus Chen's predatory smile and his promise that time can be a factor in these matters. The question was no longer whether to report the discovery, but whether she could do so before Chen's mysterious organization made their next move. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the oak grove, Nora made the most difficult decision of her life. She would call Sarah immediately and begin the process of reporting the condor chicks to the appropriate authorities. But first, she would ensure their immediate safety by any means necessary. Walking back to the house, she retrieved her father's shotgun from above the mantel and checked that it was properly loaded. The compass in her pocket seemed heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of protecting something infinitely precious and infinitely vulnerable. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The original land deed to the Whitfield ranch, signed in 1892 by Nora's great-grandfather, hung framed in the ranch office as a reminder of the generations of sacrifice that had built this legacy. As she held her father's shotgun and watched the sun disappear behind the mountain peaks, Nora understood that she was about to make decisions that would either honor that legacy or destroy it entirely. Her call to Sarah was brief and urgent. "They've hatched, all 5 of them. They're definitely condors. I'll be there in an hour," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Don't do anything until I arrive, and don't let anyone else near that nest." But as Nora waited for Sarah's arrival, she discovered that controlling access to the nest might be more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Shortly after dark, she spotted headlights approaching along the access road that Tom had identified earlier in the week. This time, the vehicle didn't stop at the ridge overlook. It continued directly toward the ranch buildings. Marcus Chen climbed out of the same black sedan. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing emerged from a second vehicle, and their body language suggested they were more than simple consultants. They moved with the systematic precision of people trained in security or law enforcement, scanning the area and positioning themselves strategically. Nora met them on the porch, her father's Winchester held casually but visibly across her arms. "Mr. Chen, you're on private property without permission. Ms. Whitfield, I apologize for the late hour, but circumstances have become somewhat urgent. My clients have received information suggesting that you may be harboring specimens of extraordinary value. We're prepared to make you an offer that would solve all of your financial difficulties. I told you before." "I don't know what you're talking about," one of Chen's companions stepped forward, and Nora noticed the outline of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. "Ms. Whitfield, we're not here to cause trouble, but we do need to conduct a brief survey of your property. If you cooperate, this can be a very profitable evening for everyone involved." The implied threat was clear, but Nora's years of living alone on the ranch had taught her that showing fear to predators, whether animal or human, was the worst possible response. "Gentlemen, you have exactly 30 seconds to get off my property before I call the sheriff's department." Chen's expression hardened. "The nearest sheriff's deputy is 25 minutes away on a good night. A lot can happen in 25 minutes. Before Nora could respond, headlights appeared on the main ranch road, and Sarah's pickup truck rounded the bend toward the house. The veterinarian took in the scene quickly, Nora with her shotgun, 3 strangers in expensive clothing, and attention that suggested potential violence. Sarah parked her truck strategically, blocking the driveway exit, and climbed out with the confident bearing of someone who dealt with difficult situations in remote locations. "Evening, folks. I'm Dr. Martinez. Is there some kind of problem here?" Chen's demeanor shifted immediately, becoming more professional and less threatening. "Dr. Martinez, we were just discussing a potential business arrangement with Ms. Whitfield. Nothing that concerns you. Actually, anything involving wildlife on this property is very much my concern. I'm the consulting veterinarian for this region." Sarah moved to stand beside Nora, presenting a united front. "And right now, I need to ask you gentlemen to leave so we can continue our scheduled consultation." For a moment, The standoff continued, with Chen clearly calculating whether to escalate the situation or withdraw. Finally, he seemed to decide that discretion was the better strategy. "Of course, Doctor. Ms. Whitfield will be in touch. I hope you'll consider our offer carefully." After Chen and his associates left, Sarah and Nora stood in the ranch yard, listening to the sound of engines disappearing into the distance. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had fundamentally changed the nature of their situation. "They're not going away," Sarah said quietly. "And next time, they might not be so polite about making their intentions clear. What exactly are we dealing with?" "Based on what I've been able to research about bioacquisition services, they're probably involved in illegal wildlife trafficking. Rare birds, especially endangered species, can be worth enormous amounts of money to private collectors or certain types of research facilities." They walked together toward the oak grove, using flashlights to navigate the familiar path in darkness. The nest area was quiet, but Nora could hear the soft sounds of the chicks settling in for their first night outside the shells. "We need to make some difficult decisions," Sarah continued. "If we report this to Fish and Wildlife Services, the chicks will be removed from the property and placed in a federal breeding program. That's probably the best outcome for the birds, but it means you lose any control over what happens here. And if we don't report it, then we're violating federal law, and Chen's organization will almost certainly escalate their efforts to acquire the birds. Either way, your quiet ranch life is over." As they approached the viewing position, Nora made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm shutting down the ranch." Sarah stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm officially suspending all ranch operations. No more cattle, no more agricultural activities. If I can't protect these birds as a rancher, maybe I can protect them as something else. Nora, you can't just abandon everything your family built." "I'm not abandoning it. I'm transforming it." The idea was crystallizing as she spoke, taking shape from impulses and instincts she hadn't fully recognized until this moment. "My great-grandfather claimed this land to build something valuable. My grandfather expanded it. My father maintained it. Maybe my job is to protect it." They spent the next hour observing the chicks and discussing possibilities. The baby condors were active despite the darkness, moving around their nest and making soft vocalizations that suggested healthy development. Their size and behavior confirmed that they would need specialized care and feeding as they grew. "If you're serious about this," Sarah said, "we need to develop a comprehensive plan. Food, shelter, medical care, legal protection. And we need to do it quickly, because Chen and his people aren't going to wait for us to figure things out. What would it take? First, we need to secure the immediate area. These chicks are vulnerable to predators, weather, and human interference. Second, we need to establish a feeding program. Condor chicks require specific nutrition, and we can't just let them fend for themselves. Third, we need legal protection, which means involving federal authorities, whether we want to or not." As they walked back toward the house, Nora felt a strange sense of liberation. For 5 years, she'd been fighting to maintain something that was slowly dying, despite her best efforts. The cattle operation was marginal at best, the financial pressures were unsustainable, and the community had already written her off as a failure. But protecting these magnificent birds, that felt like something worth fighting for. Something that could justify all the sacrifices her family had made to keep this land intact. "There's something else," Sarah said as they reached the ranch yard. "If these chicks are really California condors, their presence here raises questions that go beyond simple wildlife management. Condors don't just appear in Colorado by accident. Either there's an unknown population that's been breeding here for decades, or these birds are connected to reintroduction efforts in ways that haven't been documented." "What does that mean?" "It means we might not be the only ones with secrets, and it means the stakes might be even higher than we thought." That night, as Nora lay awake, listening to the sounds of the mountain darkness, she found herself thinking about the land deed hanging in her father's office. 4 generations of Whitfields had fought to build and maintain this ranch, each one adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Perhaps it was time for the fifth generation to chart an entirely different course. The emergency radio had saved lives during blizzards, helped coordinate search and rescue operations, and connected the Whitfield ranch to the broader community during times of crisis. Now, as Nora tested its batteries and checked its range, she realized it might become essential for protecting 5 small lives that represented hope for an entire species. The condor chicks were 3 days old and thriving under Sarah's careful monitoring. They had grown visibly since hatching, their black down becoming thicker and their movements more coordinated. Most importantly, they were eating well on the specialized diet Sarah had developed based on her research into condor biology and nutrition. "They're remarkable," Sarah said, as they watched the chicks from their concealed observation post. "Their development rate is consistent with what we know about condor growth patterns, but seeing it firsthand is extraordinary." Nora had officially suspended ranch operations that morning, posting notices that cited conservation activities as the reason for temporarily halting cattle operations. Tom and Eddie had taken the news with the stoic acceptance of men who understood that ranching was subject to forces beyond any individual's control. "You sure about this, Miss Nora?" Tom had asked. "Shutting down the ranch is a big decision." "It's the right decision," she'd replied, though she couldn't explain the full reasoning without revealing the secret that was becoming harder to keep with each passing day. The community reaction had been swift and predictable. Ruth Patterson had called within hours of hearing the news, her voice carrying the mix of concern and judgment that Nora had come to expect from neighbors who'd never quite believed in her ability to manage the ranch successfully. "Nora, dear, I hope you're not making any hasty decisions," Ruth had said. "Running a ranch is challenging, but giving up entirely seems extreme. Have you considered leasing the grazing rights to someone more experienced?" Similar calls had come from other neighbors, the bank, and even Harold Morrison, who'd seemed genuinely surprised that she was voluntarily stepping away from agricultural activities rather than being forced out by financial pressure. But the most significant reaction came from Marcus Chen, who called that afternoon with a tone that was notably less diplomatic than during his previous contacts. "Ms. Whitfield, I understand you've suspended ranch operations. That's an interesting development, given our recent conversation about specimens of value that might be present on your property. My ranch operations are none of your business, Mr. Chen. Perhaps not directly, but if you're protecting something of scientific and commercial value, my clients have legitimate interests that need to be considered. We're prepared to increase our offer substantially. I'm not interested in any offers. That's unfortunate, because other parties are beginning to take notice of activities in your area. The Wildlife Services community is small, and word travels quickly when something unusual is discovered. You may find that keeping your secrets becomes increasingly difficult." After hanging up, Nora felt the walls closing in around her increasingly complex situation. Chen's implied threats were becoming more direct, and his mention of other parties suggested that the secret was already spreading beyond her control. That concern was confirmed later in the afternoon when Sarah arrived with troubling news. "I've been contacted by colleagues in Denver asking questions about unusual bird sightings in this area. Someone is spreading information about potential condor activity. Could it be Chen's organization?" "Possibly. Or it could be someone within the federal wildlife system who's heard rumors and is trying to verify them. Either way, we're running out of time to make this situation official." They spent the evening developing what Sarah called contingency protocols, plans for protecting the chicks if the situation escalated suddenly. The birds were still too young and vulnerable to survive relocation, but they were also too valuable and legally significant to remain unprotected. The ideal scenario, Sarah explained, would be to establish this site as an official condor management area under federal oversight. That would provide legal protection while allowing the chicks to remain in their natural habitat. What would that mean for the ranch? Complete transformation. No more cattle, no more traditional ranching activities. The property would essentially become a wildlife preserve with you as the primary caretaker, assuming federal authorities approved that arrangement. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. It would represent a complete break with her family's legacy, while potentially creating something entirely new and valuable. But it would also mean placing her fate in the hands of bureaucrats who might have different priorities and perspectives. Their planning session was interrupted by the radio, crackling to life with Tom's voice reporting suspicious activity along the property's eastern boundary. "Miss Nora, I'm seeing lights moving around near the old mineral survey markers. Looks like people with flashlights, maybe 3 or 4 of them." Nora grabbed the radio's handset. "Are they on our property?" "Hard to tell from here, but they're close to the fence line. Want me to go check it out?" "No, stay where you are." "I'm going to contact the sheriff's department." But before she could make that call, Sarah's phone rang with news that changed everything. The caller was Dr. Amanda Rodriguez from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Denver, and her first words made it clear that the secret was no longer secret. "Dr. Martinez, I'm calling about reports of possible California condor activity in your consultation area. We've received information suggesting that active nesting may be occurring on private property near Steamboat Springs." Sarah looked at Nora with an expression that mixed relief and apprehension. "Dr. Rodriguez, I think we need to arrange a meeting to discuss this situation in detail. How quickly can you arrange access to the site?" "That depends on several factors, including the cooperation of the property owner and ensuring the safety of any birds that might be present. Doctor, if there are condors nesting in Colorado, this represents one of the most significant wildlife developments in decades. We need to assess the situation immediately." After Sarah finished her conversation and began making arrangements for a federal site visit, Nora realized that her brief period of controlling the situation was ending. Within days, possibly hours, her ranch would be crawling with federal wildlife experts, researchers, and administrators. The radio crackled again with Tom's voice, now carrying a note of urgency. "Miss Nora, those lights are definitely on the property now, and they're moving toward the oak grove. I think we've got trespassers." Nora grabbed her father's shotgun and the radio, motioning for Sarah to follow. "Tom, meet us at the barn. Bring Eddie if he's still around, and make sure you're both armed." As they hurried through the darkness toward what was potentially a confrontation, Nora reflected on how quickly her quiet ranch life had transformed into something resembling a wildlife thriller. 3 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been making the next mortgage payment. Now she was potentially facing off against armed intruders while trying to protect some of the rarest birds in North America. The emergency radio, in her hand, represented more than just communication equipment. It was a lifeline connecting her to the help and support she would need to navigate the challenges ahead. And based on the sounds of approaching vehicles and the distant glow of unauthorized lights near the oak grove, she was going to need all the help she could get. The hidden cave system map had been tucked away in her father's desk for decades, forgotten among the routine paperwork of ranch management. But as Nora searched through his files, looking for property boundary surveys that might help law enforcement understand the trespassing situation, she discovered something that reframed everything she thought she knew about her family's land and her father's legacy. The geological survey map dated from 1987, 2 years after her father had inherited the ranch from her grandfather. It showed extensive cave networks running beneath the eastern section of the property, with detailed notations in her father's careful handwriting. But these weren't the casual observations of a curious rancher. They were the systematic records of someone conducting scientific research. Condor roosts confirmed in caves 3 and 7. Read one notation. Adult pair observed nesting in cave 5, spring 1992. Another entry, dated just 5 years ago, noted population estimate 12 to 15 adults, successful breeding confirmed. Sarah studied the map with growing amazement. "Nora, your father wasn't just a rancher. He was conducting a secret condor conservation program. The implications were staggering. For at least 20 years, Samuel Whitfield had known about and protected a breeding population of California condors that was supposed to be extinct in Colorado. He had monitored their nesting patterns, documented their reproduction, and somehow kept their existence hidden from the scientific community and federal wildlife authorities. Tom and Eddie had arrived at the barn as requested, both men carrying rifles and looking prepared for trouble. But when Nora showed them the map and explained what they'd discovered, Tom's reaction revealed another layer to the secret. "Miss Nora," he said quietly, "I think there's something you need to know. Your father swore me to secrecy, but with him gone and this situation developing, maybe it's time." "What kind of secret?" He wasn't working alone. There was a whole network of people involved, scientists, conservationists, even some folks in the federal government. They called it the Shadow Protocol. The revelation hit Nora like a physical blow. Her father, who she'd always seen as a straightforward rancher focused on cattle and hay crops, had been involved in one of the most sophisticated wildlife conservation efforts in American history. "Why the secrecy?" Sarah asked. Tom looked uncomfortable, as if revealing information he'd promised to keep hidden. "From what I understood, the official condor recovery program had some problems. Political interference, budget constraints, disagreements about methodology. Some of the scientists involved believed the only way to ensure species survival was to establish secret breeding populations outside the official system. That's why Chen's organization is so interested," Sarah realized. "They're not just after 5 baby birds. They know about the entire population." Eddie, who had been listening with growing excitement, suddenly pointed toward the oak grove. "Speaking of which, we've still got people with flashlights heading toward the nest site." Through the darkness, they could see moving lights approaching the area where the condor chicks were hidden. The intruders were being systematic, using what appeared to be night vision equipment and moving with the coordination of a professional team. Nora made a decision that would have surprised her 3 weeks earlier. Instead of confronting the intruders directly, she would use her newfound knowledge of the cave system to outmaneuver them. "Tom, Eddie, I need you to create a distraction near the main ranch buildings. Make noise, turn on lights, do whatever it takes to draw their attention away from the oak grove. What are you and Dr. Martinez going to do?" "We're going to move the chicks to safety," using her father's map as a guide. Nora and Sarah made their way through the darkness toward cave entrance number 5, which, according to the notations, had been used for condor nesting as recently as 2 years ago. The entrance was hidden behind a cluster of boulders about 200 yards from the oak grove, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The cave was larger than Nora had expected, with a main chamber that opened into several smaller passages. Most significantly, it showed clear signs of recent condor activity, feathers, droppings, and what appeared to be roosting areas that had been used regularly. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered, using her flashlight to examine the cave walls. "Your father wasn't just protecting a secret population, he was managing an entire ecosystem." But their exploration was interrupted by sounds from the oak grove that suggested the intruders had discovered the nest site. Shouts, the crackle of radio communications, and what sounded like equipment being deployed. "We need to get those chicks," Nora said, moving through the forest with practiced stealth. They approached the oak grove from an unexpected angle. The intruders, she counted 4 men with professional equipment, had found the nest and were preparing to capture the baby condors using nets and specialized containers. Marcus. Chen was directing the operation, his earlier diplomatic facade completely abandoned. "Carefully," he instructed his team. "Each of these birds is worth more than most people make in a year. Damage them, and you answer to the clients." Nora had brought her father's shotgun, but she also had something more powerful, intimate knowledge of the terrain and the element of surprise. She and Sarah positioned themselves strategically, then created the kind of distraction that only people familiar with local wildlife could manage. Sarah's reproduction of a mountain lion's scream, amplified by the acoustic properties of the oak grove, froze the intruders in place. Before they could react, Nora appeared from behind the fallen log, with her shotgun trained on Chen. "Gentlemen, you're trespassing on private property and interfering with protected wildlife." Chen's team reached for weapons, but found themselves facing not just Nora's shotgun, but Tom and Eddie approaching from the other direction with rifles ready. "Ms. Whitfield," Chen said, his voice tight with frustration, "you have no idea what you're interfering with. These birds represent scientific breakthroughs worth millions of dollars. My clients have invested substantial resources in locating them. Your clients can invest in something legal." "Legal?" Chen laughed bitterly. "Do you think your father's secret conservation program was legal? Do you think the federal authorities are going to appreciate learning that endangered species have been breeding on private property for decades without official oversight?" The comment hit home because it highlighted a problem Nora hadn't fully considered. If her father had indeed been operating outside official channels, his conservation efforts might be viewed as violations of federal law rather than heroic species protection. But before she could respond to Chen's implications, new lights appeared through the forest, vehicles approaching with the systematic precision of law enforcement. Within minutes, the oak grove was surrounded by federal agents wearing tactical gear and carrying automatic weapons. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, announced a woman's voice amplified by a bullhorn. "Everyone put down your weapons and step into the open with your hands visible." As they complied with the federal agent's instructions, Nora realized that the situation had moved far beyond anything she could control through individual action. The secret her father had protected for decades was now fully exposed, and the consequences would reshape not just her life, but the entire approach to condor conservation in North America. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the Wildlife Service official who had called Sarah earlier, emerged from the group of federal agents with an expression that mixed professional authority with genuine scientific excitement. "Dr. Martinez, Ms. Whitfield, we need to talk. And Mr. Chen," she continued, turning toward the wildlife trafficker, "you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy to violate the Endangered Species Act." As Chen and his team were led away in handcuffs, Dr. Rodriguez approached the nest site where the 5 condor chicks were huddled together, apparently unharmed by the evening's excitement. "Ms. Whitfield," she said quietly, "your father's conservation work represents one of the most significant wildlife success stories in modern history. But it also represents one of the most complex legal situations we've ever encountered. What happens now? Now we figure out how to protect both the birds and the people who've been protecting them, starting with a complete survey of the cave system and an assessment of the entire condor population your father helped preserve." As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, Nora realized that her life had changed irreversibly. The ranch that had defined her family for 4 generations was about to become something entirely different, a focal point for one of the most important conservation efforts in American history. The secret her father had carried to his grave was finally revealed, but it had opened doors to possibilities she never could have imagined. The letters were hidden in a wooden box beneath her father's desk, wrapped in oiled cloth and organized with the same methodical care he'd brought to every aspect of ranch management. But these weren't business correspondence or routine communications with agricultural suppliers. They were decades of secret exchanges with some of the most respected names in American conservation biology. Dr. Michael Harrison from the San Diego Zoo, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Peregrine Fund, Dr. Robert Chen from the University of California, names Nora recognized from nature documentaries and scientific publications. All of them had been corresponding with her father about what the letters referred to as the Colorado Project. "Samuel," wrote Dr. Harrison in a letter dated 1995, "the breeding success you've documented this season exceeds our most optimistic projections. The genetic diversity analysis suggests this population may be crucial for overall species recovery. Another letter from Dr. Walsh praised her father's innovative approach to habitat management. Your integration of traditional ranching practices with conservation objectives has created an environment where condors can thrive alongside human activities. This model could revolutionize our approach to species recovery on private lands. Sarah read over Nora's shoulder as they worked through the correspondence by lamplight in the ranch office. Federal agents had established a command post in the barn, but Dr. Rodriguez had given them permission to search through Samuel's records to better understand the scope of his conservation work. "This is extraordinary," Sarah murmured. "Your father wasn't just protecting condors. He was pioneering a completely new approach to endangered species management." The most recent letters revealed the growing pressure that had surrounded Samuel's final years. Federal budget cuts had reduced funding for official condor programs. Political changes in Washington had created uncertainty about long-term conservation commitments. Some of the scientists involved in the Colorado project had been urging Samuel to make the population's existence public before external factors forced disclosure. The window for voluntary revelation is closing. Dr. Chen had written just 18 months before Samuel's death. If this population is discovered through other channels, the legal and scientific consequences could be severe for everyone involved. But Samuel had been reluctant to expose the secret prematurely. His final letter to the group, dated just 3 months before his heart attack, expressed concerns about Nora's preparedness to handle the situation. "My daughter has the heart for this work, but not yet the knowledge. I need more time to prepare her, to help her understand what she would be inheriting along with the ranch." Reading those words, Nora felt the full weight of her father's burden. He had died before he could share the truth with her, leaving her to discover it under the worst possible circumstances. Dr. Rodriguez entered the office carrying a tablet computer loaded with preliminary survey data from the cave system. "Ms. Whitfield, we've completed the initial population assessment. The results are remarkable. The numbers were staggering. 17 adult condors, 8 juveniles from previous year's breeding, and now 5 newly hatched chicks. 30 birds total, representing nearly 10% of the entire world population of California condors. This isn't just a breeding population," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "It's a genetically distinct group that could be crucial for species recovery. Your father's conservation work has potentially saved the California condor from extinction, but the revelation brought complications as well as celebration. The federal agents had discovered evidence that Marcus Chen's organization had been monitoring the Colorado population for months, possibly years. They had intercepted communications between Chen and collectors in Asia and Europe who were willing to pay enormous sums for access to rare condor specimens. The international wildlife trafficking network is more sophisticated than most people realize, explained Agent Sarah Collins, who was leading the federal investigation. Chen's organization was part of a larger operation that targets endangered species for private collectors and unauthorized research facilities. More troubling was the discovery that Chen's group had been planning a massive capture operation that would have removed most or all of the adult condors from the Colorado site. The plan, outlined in documents seized from Chen's vehicle, involved tranquilizing the birds and transporting them to facilities in Mexico and Canada, where they would be bred for the illegal pet trade. If they had succeeded, Dr. Rodriguez said grimly, it would have been one of the most devastating losses in conservation history. The immediate challenge facing Nora and the federal authorities was developing a plan that would protect the condor population while addressing the legal complexities created by decades of unofficial conservation work. The birds needed specialized care, protected habitat, and scientific monitoring, but they also needed to remain in the environment where they had successfully bred for over 20 years. The ideal solution, Dr. Rodriguez explained during an evening planning session. It would be to establish this site as an official condor recovery facility under federal management. But that would require your cooperation as the property owner and your commitment to a completely different kind of land use. What would that mean, practically? It would mean converting the Whitfield Ranch into the Whitfield Condor Preserve. No more cattle operations, no more traditional ranching activities. The property would become a research and breeding facility for one of the most endangered birds in North America. The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. It would represent the ultimate transformation of her family's legacy, from cattle ranchers to wildlife conservationists. But it would also provide financial stability through federal conservation funding and research grants. There's something else you should consider, Sarah added. If you agree to this arrangement, you would essentially become the lead field researcher for the Colorado condor population. Your intimate knowledge of the local environment and your father's historical records would make you invaluable to the long-term success of the project. That night, as Nora walked the familiar paths of her ranch under a canopy of mountain stars, she reflected on the choices that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been a struggling rancher facing foreclosure, dismissed by neighbors, who doubted her ability to maintain what her family had built. Now she was being offered the opportunity to create something entirely new, a conservation legacy that could influence endangered species recovery for generations to come. The condor chicks, now a week old and growing rapidly under Sarah's care, had become symbols of transformation and hope. Their presence on the ranch represented not just biological success, but the possibility that traditional land use and conservation objectives could coexist in ways that benefited both human communities and wildlife populations. But the decision wasn't just about her own future. Tom and Eddie, who had worked loyally for the ranch for years, would need to be retrained for conservation work or find employment elsewhere. The broader community, which had already written off the Whitfield Ranch as a failed operation, would need to accept a completely different kind of land use in their midst. Most significantly, Nora would be stepping into a role that required expertise she didn't yet possess. Managing a condor conservation facility would mean learning about avian biology, conservation genetics, habitat management, and federal wildlife regulations. It would mean working with scientists, government officials, and conservation organizations at the highest levels. The next morning brought news that would force her decision. Dr. Rodriguez received word from Washington that the discovery of the Colorado condor population had attracted attention at the highest levels of the Interior Department. Officials were already discussing the possibility of designating the Whitfield Ranch as a national wildlife research facility, which would provide substantial federal funding, but would also place the property under direct government oversight. The decision needs to be made quickly, Dr. Rodriguez explained. If you're willing to partner with us, we can begin the transition process immediately. If not, we'll need to explore alternative arrangements for protecting the birds. Standing in the oak grove, where she had first discovered the mysterious eggs, surrounded by federal scientists and conservation experts, Nora realized that her quiet life as a struggling rancher was ending, whether she chose it or not. The question was whether she would shape the transformation or simply react to changes imposed by others. The 5 condor chicks, now mobile enough to explore beyond their original nest, represented both the weight of responsibility and the promise of renewal. They were living symbols of her father's hidden legacy and harbingers of a future she was only beginning to imagine. The compass her mother had carried through the wilderness seemed heavier in her pocket, weighted with the significance of the direction she was about to choose. For the first time in years, Nora felt like she was standing at a crossroads where all paths led toward something meaningful and important. The only question was whether she had the courage to follow where they led. The field binoculars had belonged to her father for 30 years. their worn leather grips shaped by countless hours of wildlife observation. As Nora adjusted the focus to watch the adult condors circling high above the ranch, she realized that Samuel Whitfield had been preparing her for this moment her entire life. She just hadn't understood the lessons he was teaching. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the thermal updrafts rising from the sun-warmed slopes. "Two adults, possibly the parents of our chicks." The magnificent birds soared with the effortless grace that had made condors symbols of wilderness and freedom for thousands of years. Their wingspans exceeded 9 feet, and even at a distance of several hundred yards, their presence dominated the mountain landscape. But this wasn't just a wildlife viewing opportunity. This was the moment when Nora would need to prove that she could protect not just 5 baby birds, but an entire population that represented decades of secret conservation work. Dr. Rodriguez had received disturbing news from the federal investigation into Marcus Chen's organization. Despite Chen's arrest, his associates had not abandoned their plans. Intelligence suggested that a larger team was being assembled for what investigators termed a final extraction attempt. "They know we've discovered the cave system," Agent Collins explained during the morning briefing. "And they know that once the site becomes officially protected, their window for illegal access will close permanently. We expect them to make their move within the next 24 hours. The plan to protect the condors involved coordinating multiple elements, federal agents positioned throughout the property, scientific teams ready to relocate the birds if necessary, and Sarah's mobile veterinary unit standing by to provide emergency medical care if any animals were injured during a confrontation. Nora's role was to serve as the primary guide for federal personnel who weren't familiar with the ranch's terrain and to make real-time decisions about bird safety as situations developed. "Remember," Dr. Rodriguez emphasized, "our priority is protecting the animals. Property damage can be repaired, equipment can be replaced, but these birds represent irreplaceable genetic diversity for the species." The first signs of trouble appeared just after noon, when Tom radioed from his position near the eastern boundary to report unfamiliar vehicles approaching along the old mining roads that provided backcountry access to the property. "At least 3 trucks. Maybe 4, Tom reported. They're not using the main access roads. And they're moving like they know where they're going." Agent Collins coordinated the federal response, positioning her teams to intercept the intruders before they could reach the cave system or the nest sites. But the approaching vehicles split up, taking different routes through the forest in what appeared to be a coordinated attempt to divide the defending forces. "They've done reconnaissance," Agent Collins realized. "This isn't a simple smash-and-grab operation. They know our defensive positions." Nora found herself thinking like her father, trying to anticipate how someone with intimate knowledge of condor behavior and habitat requirements would plan an extraction operation. The birds were most vulnerable during their daily feeding routines, when adults would bring food to the chicks and remain at ground level for extended periods. "They're going to target the feeding sites," she told Dr. Rodriguez. "The adults follow predictable patterns when they're caring for chicks. If someone wanted to capture multiple birds efficiently, they'd wait for the feeding window." That realization led to a tactical decision that went against every conservation instinct, but might be necessary for long-term species protection. They would temporarily disrupt the condor's normal routines, using Sarah's specialized equipment to create artificial feeding opportunities that would keep the birds away from their usual vulnerable locations. The plan required Nora to demonstrate skills she'd developed during years of ranch management, the ability to predict animal behavior, to coordinate complex logistics under pressure, and to make rapid decisions when situations changed unexpectedly. Working with Sarah, she established alternative feeding stations deeper in the cave system, areas that would be difficult for intruders to access, but that would still meet the nutritional needs of both adult and juvenile birds. "The chicks are young enough to adapt to temporary changes in routine," Sarah explained as they prepared specialized food supplies. But the adults may be resistant to alterations in their established patterns. The test came at 3 o'clock, when the daily feeding cycle normally began. Using a combination of natural food placement and audio recordings of condor vocalizations, they successfully guided the adult birds toward the protected cave areas rather than their usual surface feeding sites. From her position overlooking the oak grove, Nora watched through the binoculars as the magnificent birds adapted to the new routine with intelligence that reinforced her father's writings about condor cognitive abilities. But even as the immediate tactical challenge was being met, radio communications indicated that the approaching threat was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. Agent Collins reported that surveillance had identified at least 8 vehicles and possibly 15 individuals involved in what appeared to be a coordinated assault on multiple access points. "This is more than wildlife trafficking," Agent Collins announced. "This is organized crime with substantial resources and professional planning." As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the mountain landscape, Nora realized that the confrontation she'd been preparing for was about to test not just her ability to protect the condors, but her understanding of the legacy her father had entrusted to her care. The Conservation Trust papers had been prepared by federal attorneys working through the night, transforming complex legal concepts into a document that would permanently protect the Whitfield Ranch as a condor preserve, while ensuring Nora's role as its primary guardian. But as gunfire echoed through the mountain forest, those papers seemed like distant abstractions compared to the immediate reality of protecting 30 living birds from armed criminals. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, demonstrating a level of coordination that confirmed Agent Collins's assessment about organized crime involvement. The trafficking organization had deployed teams with military-style equipment and tactics, suggesting resources far beyond what a simple wildlife smuggling operation should possess. "Contact North Sector," Agent Collins reported over the radio. "Multiple subjects with automatic weapons attempting to breach the perimeter near cave entrance 7. Nora crouched behind a granite outcropping with Dr. Rodriguez and Sarah, watching federal agents engage in running firefights with intruders who moved through the forest with professional competence. The sound of automatic weapons fire was alien in the mountain wilderness, a violent intrusion into an environment that had known only natural sounds for thousands of years. "The birds," Sarah whispered urgently. "The gunfire is going to panic them." Indeed, the condors were reacting to the chaos with behaviors that demonstrated their intelligence and survival instincts. The adults had gathered the younger birds deeper into the cave system, but several juveniles were visible at cave entrances, apparently uncertain whether to flee or remain hidden. Nora made a decision that drew on both her ranching experience and her growing understanding of condor behavior. Using hand signals she'd developed with Sarah over the past week, she began moving toward the nearest cave entrance, hoping to provide the kind of calm human presence that might reassure the frightened birds. "Nora, that's too dangerous," Dr. Rodriguez called out, but Nora was already moving, staying low and using the terrain for cover. The cave entrance was 50 yards away through open ground that offered minimal protection from the crossfire between federal agents and trafficking organization members. But Nora had spent her entire life reading this landscape, and she knew routes that would be invisible to outsiders, moving from boulder to boulder, using depression in the ground and scattered pine trees for concealment. She reached the cave entrance just as 2 juvenile condors emerged, apparently seeking to rejoin their family group, but confused by the chaos surrounding them. The magnificent birds were less than 10 feet away, close enough for her to see the intelligence in their dark eyes and the subtle variations in their plumage that marked them as individuals rather than simply representatives of an endangered species. "Easy," she whispered, using the same tone she'd employed with nervous cattle during thunderstorms. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The condors paused, tilting their heads with the curiosity that her father had documented in his field notes. For a moment, Human and birds existed in a bubble of calm, surrounded by violence, connected by bonds of trust that transcended species boundaries. But the moment was shattered by the arrival of three men in camouflage clothing who emerged from the forest behind Nora. Carrying nets and tranquilizer equipment, they had circumvented the federal perimeter and were moving directly toward the cave entrance where the most valuable birds were sheltering. Nora found herself between the condors and their would-be captors, armed only with her father's shotgun and the fierce protectiveness that had driven her family to defend this land for 4 generations. "Step away from the birds," the lead man commanded, raising what appeared to be a military-style rifle. "We don't want to hurt anyone, but those animals are worth more than your entire ranch." "Over my dead body," Nora replied, and realized she meant it literally. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. 3 armed men with professional equipment facing a single woman with a hunting shotgun and an absolute refusal to abandon the creatures she'd sworn to protect. The resolution came from an unexpected direction. Agent Collins and 2 federal agents appeared on the ridgeline above the cave entrance, having flanked the trafficking team while Nora held their attention. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" The brief firefight that followed was intense but decisive. The trafficking organization members, outgunned and outmaneuvered, surrendered after one of their number was wounded, attempting to flee through the forest. As federal agents secured the prisoners and provided medical care for the wounded trafficker, Nora remained near the cave entrance with the 2 juvenile condors, who had stayed close to her throughout the confrontation, as if recognizing her as a protector rather than a threat. Dr. Rodriguez approached carefully, documenting the bird's behavior with scientific fascination. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "They're treating you as part of their social group." The larger battle was concluding throughout the forest, with federal agents systematically capturing or driving off the remaining members of the trafficking organization. Radio reports indicated that the condor population had remained safe throughout the confrontation, protected by the cave system's natural defenses and the coordinated efforts of conservation professionals. As sunset approached and the mountain forest began to return to its natural rhythms, Nora signed the conservation trust papers that would transform the Whitfield Ranch into the Whitfield Condor Preserve, ensuring permanent protection for the birds her father had spent decades safeguarding. The signature felt like both an ending and a beginning, the culmination of 5 years of struggle to maintain her family's legacy and the first step toward creating something entirely new and unprecedented in American conservation history. The new wooden sign stood where the old Whitfield Ranch marker had welcomed visitors for 4 generations, hand-carved from local pine by Eddie Martinez, who had discovered an unexpected talent for woodworking. It read, "Whitfield Conservation Preserve," in letters that caught the morning light like a promise kept. 6 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, Nora stood on her porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over mountains that looked the same as they had throughout her childhood, but felt entirely different. The landscape remained unchanged, but her relationship with it had been transformed in ways that continued to surprise her. The condor chicks, now confident juveniles with developing flight feathers, had become the stars of a conservation success story that had attracted international attention. Scientific American had featured the preserve on its cover. The National Geographic Society had funded a documentary about her father's secret conservation work. Universities across the country were sending graduate students to study the unique population genetics of the Colorado condors. But for Nora, the most meaningful changes were quieter and more personal. Sarah had accepted a position as the preserve's chief veterinarian, moving her practice to a new facility built near the ranch house, with funding from the Federal Conservation Partnership. Their professional collaboration had deepened into something more personal over the months of working together to establish care protocols for the expanding condor population. "Morning," Sarah said. joining Nora on the porch with her own coffee mug. The juveniles were testing their wings again yesterday evening. Dr. Harrison thinks they'll be ready for supervised flight training within the month. The preserve now employed 12 people full-time, including Tom and Eddie, who had transitioned from ranch hands to wildlife technicians with enthusiasm that had surprised everyone. Tom had discovered a natural aptitude for condor behavior observation, while Eddie had become the preserve's specialist in habitat management and maintenance. Ruth Patterson, who had once questioned Nora's ability to manage a cattle ranch, now served on the preserve's community advisory board and regularly brought school groups for educational tours. "I have to admit," Ruth had said during the previous month's board meeting, "I never imagined something like this could work. But what you've created here is remarkable." The financial transformation had been equally dramatic. Federal conservation funding, research grants, and carefully managed ecotourism had generated more revenue than the cattle operation had ever produced. The preserve operated with a healthy budget surplus that was reinvested in expanding conservation programs and improving facilities. Most importantly, the condor population was thriving. The original adult pairs had produced 3 additional clutches, resulting in 12 new chicks over the breeding seasons since the preserve's establishment. Population genetic studies had confirmed that the Colorado birds represented crucial genetic diversity for the species' overall recovery. Dr. Rodriguez, who now served as the federal liaison for the preserve, had become a regular visitor and close friend. Her monthly reports to Washington consistently highlighted the Colorado site as a model for public-private conservation partnerships. "We're documenting breeding success rates that exceed our best projections," she'd reported at the most recent Scientific Advisory Committee meeting. The integration of traditional land management practices with modern conservation science has created an environment where condors can flourish. But perhaps the most significant change was in Nora herself, the struggling rancher who had once felt overwhelmed by the weight of maintaining. Her family's legacy had become a confident conservation professional whose expertise was sought by wildlife managers across the country. She had completed certification, programs in wildlife management and conservation biology. She had presented research findings at national conferences. She had testified before congressional committees about the importance of private land conservation initiatives. Yet standing on her porch in the early morning quiet, watching the familiar mountains emerge from darkness, she felt most connected to the simple satisfaction of caring for the land and the creatures that called it home. The oak grove, where she had first discovered the mysterious eggs, had been designated as the preserve's primary research area, with observation, blinds and monitoring equipment that allowed scientists to study condor behavior without disturbing their natural patterns. But Nora still made daily walks to the site, maintaining the personal connection that had started everything. The 5 original chicks, now approaching their first birthday, had become ambassadors for their species. 3 of them showed strong flight development and would likely join the breeding population within 2 years. The other 2 displayed the calm temperament that made them ideal for educational programs and public outreach activities. "I keep thinking about your father," Sarah said, as they walked together toward the research facility for the day's first condor health assessments. "He would be amazed to see what his secret project has become." "I think he knew," Nora replied. "Not the specifics, but the potential. He always talked about the land taking care of us if we took care of it. He just saw farther ahead than I could." The preserve's visitor center, built near the site of the old cattle barn, welcomed over 10,000 guests each year. School children from across Colorado and neighboring states came to learn about conservation biology and see living symbols of species recovery. Researchers from around the world studied the preserve's management techniques and applied them to conservation challenges in their own regions. But the most meaningful visitors were often local community members who had watched the transformation with curiosity and growing pride. The preserve had become a source of regional identity, a demonstration that rural communities could lead rather than simply adapt to conservation initiatives. As the morning progressed and the day's work began, monitoring bird health, maintaining research equipment, coordinating with visiting scientists, Nora found herself thinking about legacy and continuity. Her family had maintained this land for 4 generations, each adding their own contribution to what became a shared heritage. Her great-grandfather had claimed the land. Her grandfather had expanded it. Her father had protected it while secretly nurturing one of conservation's greatest success stories. Now it was her turn to build something that would endure and inspire future generations. The wooden sign at the preserve entrance would weather and fade over time, just as the old ranch markers had. But the work it represented, the careful balance between human needs and wildlife protection, the demonstration that conservation and community, prosperity could coexist, that would endure as long as people cared about the relationship between land and life, standing in the oak grove where everything had begun. Watching juvenile condors test their wings against the vast Colorado sky, Nora understood that she had found her true calling, not by abandoning her family's legacy, but by transforming it into something even more meaningful and enduring. The compass her mother had carried through the wilderness had finally brought her home.